In the sterile, silent world of high finance and corporate power, a name is everything. For Catherine Blackwood, the formidable CEO of Stratos Innovations, her name was a shield, a legacy, and a fortress. But from the window of her penthouse office, another name, one she didn't even know, began to haunt her nights. He was Owen Jensen, the night janitor, a man invisible to the world. A simple, haunting melody he hummed in the empty hallways unlocked a memory she thought was buried forever. Driven by a force she couldn't comprehend, she broke her own rules and followed him into the city's shadows. What she discovered would not only shatter her perception of him, but would unravel a devastating secret, tying their pasts together in a way neither could have ever imagined. This isn't just a story of wealth and poverty. It's about the secrets we keep and the lives we unknowingly destroy. The city of Stirling City was Catherine Blackwood's kingdom. From the 44th floor of the Stratos Tower, the metropolis sprawled below her, a glittering tapestry of lights woven with the threads of commerce and ambition. Each light represented a life, a story, a struggle she had long since detached herself from. Her world was one of numbers on a screen of quarterly reports and hostile takeovers. It was a world of polished glass chrome, and a silence so profound it had its own sound, a low humming thrum of power and isolation. Catherine at 38 was a widow, sculpted by grief and pressure into something formidable. Her husband Richard had been gone for 5 years, the victim of a reckless driver and a fate that cared little for stock portfolios. His death had left a void that she had filled meticulously and relentlessly with work. Her raven-black hair was always pulled back into a severe chignon, her grey eyes rarely betrayed emotion, and her designer suits were armor. She commanded boardrooms with a quiet intensity that left seasoned executives unnerved. She was respected, feared, and utterly achingly alone. Her nights were her longest days. While the city slept, Catherine worked. It was on one of these nights, a Tuesday steeped in the sterile glow of her monitor, that the silence was first broken. It wasn't a loud noise, but a soft, almost imperceptible sound drifting from the hallway, a man humming. It was a simple, melancholic lullaby, a tune that felt both foreign and deeply familiar. Curiosity, an emotion she hadn't indulged in years, pricked at her. She rose from her leather chair, the joints of her tired body protesting, and walked to the floor-to-ceiling glass door of her office. Peering into the vast, dimly lit corridor, she saw him, the night janitor. She didn't know his name. To her, he had been a fleeting presence, a shadow with a cleaning cart, a uniform and a practiced invisibility. Tonight, however, he was not invisible. Under the muted glow of the emergency lights, he moved with a strange, weary grace. He wasn't just mopping the floor. He was methodical, his strokes long, and even as if he were painting on a canvas of polished marble. He was tall and lean, with the stoop of a man who carried more than the weight of his own body. His hair was a sandy brown, and though she couldn't see his face clearly, she could sense a profound exhaustion in his posture. And he hummed. That melody. It tugged at a thread deep within her memory. Catherine closed her eyes, and for a fleeting moment, she was a child again, tucked into bed, her father's rough hand on her forehead, humming that exact tune to ward off nightmares. The memory was so vivid it made her gasp. Her father had been a builder, a man with calloused hands and a warm heart, gone long before Richard, long before the glass tower and the crushing loneliness. She watched the janitor for nearly 10 minutes. He moved from one end of the long corridor to the other, his quiet work a stark contrast to the cutthroat business conducted there during the day. As he worked his way closer to her office, she saw his face more clearly in a shaft of moonlight breaking through the massive windows. It was a kind face, but etched with lines of worry that seemed too deep for a man who couldn't be much older than she was. His eyes, a shade of tired blue, seemed to be looking at something far beyond the marble floors. During his break, he didn't scroll through a phone or listen to music. He sat on a bench by the windows, pulled a small worn sketchbook and a pencil from his bag, and began to draw. His hand moved with a confidence and precision that was startling. From her vantage point, Catherine couldn't see what he was sketching, but the intensity of his focus was mesmerizing. This was not the idle doodling of a bored man. It was the work of an artist, a creator. Who was this man who cleaned her floors and hummed her father's lullaby? The question lodged itself in her mind and refused to be dislodged. For the rest of the week, she found herself manufacturing reasons to stay later, just to observe him. She learned his routine. He would start on the executive floor at 11:00 p.m. His break was at 1:30 a.m. He was quiet, diligent, and always alone. She noticed the small things, the way he would carefully straighten a stack of magazines in the lobby, the worn-out soles of his work boots, a faint scar above his left eyebrow. One night, as he passed her office, a piece of paper slipped from the pocket of his jacket. He didn't notice. It fluttered under a nearby desk. For a full minute after he was gone, Catherine stared at it. It was none of her business. It was a violation of his privacy. But the pull of that melody of the sketchbook, of the profound mystery of the man himself, was too strong. Her heart pounding with a strange mix of guilt and anticipation, she slipped out of her office. The paper was not a note or a receipt. It was a drawing clearly done by a child. A crayon-drawn picture of two stick figures holding hands under a lopsided, smiling sun. One figure was large, labeled Daddy. The other was small, with long, scribbled brown hair, labeled Maya. Below the picture, in wobbly, uncertain letters, was a sentence, "You are my superhero, Daddy. I love you." Catherine's breath hitched. A wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled her knees washed over her. It wasn't just sadness. It was a deep, resonant empathy. This shadow in the halls, this man with tired eyes and a forgotten lullaby, was a father. A superhero to a little girl named Maya. She looked from the childish drawing to the vast, empty corridor he had just cleaned. Her world of billion-dollar deals and market projections suddenly felt hollow, a fragile shell of an existence. She had built an empire of things, of assets and entities, but this man with his worn-out boots and a crayon drawing in his pocket possessed a treasure she had lost long ago, a connection. A reason. That night, Catherine Blackwood made a decision that would forever alter the trajectory of her life. She folded the drawing carefully, placing it in her own pocket. She would return it, of course. But first she had to understand. She had to know the story behind the man who haunted her quiet, lonely nights. As she watched him pack up his cart at the end of his shift, a new, unsettling resolve took hold. She would follow him. She had to see the world that had created a man of such quiet dignity and heartbreaking art. She had to know what kind of life a superhero janitor lived after he left her glass tower. The decision once made settled in Catherine's stomach like a cold, hard stone. It was illogical, reckless, and bordered on unethical. She was the CEO of a publicly traded company. Following an employee, a janitor no less, was a catastrophic breach of professional boundaries. Her legal team would have a collective aneurysm. Her board would question her stability. Yet the gravitational pull of Owen Jensen's quiet mystery was stronger than her logic. That childish drawing in her pocket felt heavier than any shareholder report. For the next 2 nights, She was a nervous wreck, her resolve wavering. She would watch him from her office, the drawing of Daddy and Maya tucked safely in her desk drawer, and her courage would fail her. She was Catherine Blackwood. She didn't follow people. She led them. She summoned them. She dismissed them. This clandestine act of pursuit felt like a betrayal of the iron-clad persona she had so carefully constructed since Richard's death. But the alternative, returning to her sterile penthouse apartment, to the echoing silence and the ghost of a life she once had, was even less appealing. The janitor, this Owen Jensen, she'd had her assistant discreetly pull his employee file. Her first small transgression had become a focal point for all the unanswered questions in her own life. His existence was a quiet rebuke to her own. On Friday night, her resolve hardened. A brutal 8-hour meeting about a potential merger had left her feeling drained and disconnected, more like a corporate machine than a human being. The thought of her empty home was unbearable. Tonight, she would do it. She changed out of her severe business suit into a pair of dark jeans, a simple cashmere sweater, and a plain black peacoat she kept in her private closet for emergencies. She swapped her stilettos for a pair of comfortable flats, feeling like an imposter in her own skin. As the clock ticked towards 4:00 a.m., the end of Owen's shift, she felt a thrum of adrenaline she hadn't experienced since her early days of building the company. From her window, she watched him exit the building through a service door in the back alley. He pulled the hood of a worn grey sweatshirt over his head against the chill of the early morning air and began his walk, his shoulders slumped with the fatigue of a night's physical labor. Catherine gave him a 2-minute head start. Taking the private elevator down to the executive garage, she bypassed her chauffeured sedan and slipped into her personal vehicle, a sleek, unassuming, dark grey Audi she rarely drove herself. Her hands felt clammy on the leather steering wheel. This was madness. She pulled out of the garage and navigated the deserted downtown streets, keeping a safe distance, her headlights dimmed. Owen didn't head towards the main transit hubs as she expected. Instead, he walked west, away from the glittering heart of Sterling City, his pace steady and unwavering. He passed under the concrete overpasses of the freeway, where the city's opulence began to fray at the edges. The gleaming skyscrapers gave way to older brick buildings, their facades marked with graffiti and the grime of decades. The boutique shops were replaced by laundromats, check-cashing stores, and bodegas with flickering neon signs. Catherine felt a pang of discomfort. This was a part of the city she only ever saw from the freeway or the window of a private jet. It was a world away from her curated existence of Michelin star restaurants and charity galas. She, who prided herself on understanding markets and demographics, knew nothing of the lives lived in these streets. Owen walked for nearly 2 miles. He moved with a sense of purpose, not once looking over his shoulder. He was just a man heading home after a long night of work. The guilt churned in Catherine's gut. She was invading his life, turning his simple commute into a spectacle for her own selfish curiosity. But she couldn't turn back now. She was a scientist, observing an unknown element, and she had to see the experiment through. He finally turned onto a narrow residential street named Hawthorne Avenue. It was lined with small 2-story apartment buildings and aging duplexes. The lawns were patchy, and a few cars years past their prime were parked along the curb. It was a neighborhood that wasn't quite impoverished, but was clearly clinging to respectability by a thread. Owen stopped in front of one of the more modest buildings, a plain beige stucco structure with iron railings on the second-floor balconies. He fumbled for his keys, the jangling sound carrying clearly in the pre-dawn stillness, and let himself into the main door. Catherine parked her car across the street, a block down, partially hidden, by the low-hanging branches of an old oak tree. She cut the engine, and the silence of the neighborhood enveloped her. A single light flicked on in a second-floor apartment window. That had to be his. What had she expected to find? She wasn't sure. But as she sat there watching that solitary square of yellow light against the dark facade, a profound sense of melancholy settled over her. In her world home was a sprawling, empty space, with a view of 1,000 other empty offices. For him, home was this single beacon of light in a sleeping, struggling neighborhood. She waited for what she still didn't know. Maybe she thought he'd emerge, his secret life revealed. But the minutes stretched into a half-hour. The sky began to lighten, the inky blackness softening to a deep indigo. A few lights in other windows began to flicker on. The city was stirring. Just as she was about to dismiss the entire venture as a foolish, fruitless whim, a silhouette appeared in the window. It wasn't Owen's. It was smaller, slighter. A child. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. It was Maya. The little girl was standing on a chair, it seemed, peering out the window. Even from this distance, Catherine could see the child's face press against the glass, her breath fogging it up. Then the larger silhouette of Owen appeared behind her. He knelt down, and Catherine could see him wrap his arms around his daughter, his head resting on her small shoulder. He was pointing at something outside. The dawn, perhaps. It was a simple, silent tableau, a moment of pure, unadorned love between a father and his child. There was no sound, no context, but the image was so potent, so deeply resonant, it struck Catherine with the force of a physical blow. She saw the exhaustion in Owen's posture melt away as he held his daughter. She saw the absolute trust in the way the little girl leaned back against him. In that instant, her pursuit ceased to be about a lullaby or a sketchbook. It became about this connection, this fierce, quiet love that flourished in a humble apartment on a forgotten street. It was a raw, unfiltered humanity that her own life was utterly devoid of. A tear, hot and unexpected, traced a path down her cheek. It was the first tear she had shed for anything other than Richard in 5 years. It wasn't a tear of pity for Owen's circumstances, but a tear of something closer to envy. Or perhaps it was a tear of recognition, a painful acknowledgement of the gaping hole in her own life that no amount of success or wealth could ever fill. She stayed until the sun had fully risen, painting the sky in strokes of pink and orange. She watched as the light in the window was turned off, the small family's private morning rituals concluded. As she finally started her car and drove away back towards the gleaming, empty heart of the city, Catherine Blackwood knew that she hadn't just followed a man home. She had followed him to the edge of her own world and had been forced to look back at the barren landscape of her own heart. The mystery of Owen Jensen had deepened, but it was no longer just curiosity that drove her. It was a desperate, burgeoning need to understand the source of the light she had just witnessed in that window. The image of Owen and Maya in the window haunted Catherine for the entire weekend. It played on a loop in her mind during board meetings, during conference calls, and in the suffocating silence of her penthouse. The simple, profound affection she had witnessed made her own vast, empty apartment feel less like a home and more like a mausoleum. The city view from her window, once a symbol of her power, now seemed like a pane of glass separating her from the real, breathing world below. Her curiosity had morphed into a full-blown obsession. It wasn't romantic, not in the traditional sense. It was more profound than that. Owen Jensen had become a mirror reflecting everything her life lacked: warmth, purpose beyond profit, and a love that was both fierce and gentle. She had to know more. The risk was enormous, but the emptiness she felt was a far greater threat. The following week she did it again, and again. Her late nights at the office became a pretext for her new secret ritual. Each time she would follow his weary path from the gleaming Stratos Tower to the quiet humility of Hawthorne Avenue. She learned the rhythm of his life from a distance. He would get home around 4:15 a.m. The light in Maya's room would come on around 6:30 a.m. He would walk her to a school bus stop at the corner at 7:45 a.m., her small hand tucked securely in his. He always knelt to speak to her before she boarded a brief but intense moment of connection before she disappeared onto the bus. One morning, after he had sent Maya off to school, Catherine watched him walk not back to his apartment, but to a small park a few blocks away. He sat on a bench, not with a sketchbook this time, but with a thermos of what she assumed was coffee. He just sat there watching the sun climb higher in the sky, a look of profound weariness and contemplation on his face. He was a man caught between two worlds, the exhausting night and the demanding day. He was a father whose work was never done. Driven by an impulse she couldn't control, Catherine decided to get closer. The next day she dressed down again, this time adding a simple baseball cap to her ensemble. She parked her car several blocks away and walked to a small coffee shop across the street from the park where Owen had his morning reprieve. Hiding behind a newspaper and a steaming mug, she watched. From this proximity she could see the details that distance had obscured. The frayed cuffs of his jacket, the way he rubbed his tired eyes, the deep lines of stress around his mouth that seemed to momentarily vanish whenever a child on the nearby playground laughed. He wasn't just tired. He was bone-weary, running on fumes of love and obligation. It was during this surveillance that she saw the first crack in his stoic facade. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, and a well-dressed woman got out. She approached Owen with a look of barely concealed pity. Their conversation was brief and tense. Catherine couldn't hear the words, but the body language was clear. The woman, a sister perhaps, or an in-law, gestured with frustration towards his apartment building. Owen's posture became rigid, his answers short and clipped. He shook his head, refusing something she offered, a folder or maybe an envelope of cash. The woman finally threw her hands up in exasperation, got back in her car and sped away. Owen watched her go, his jaw tight, before burying his face in his hands for a long moment. The mask of the stoic superhero dad had slipped, revealing the desperate man beneath. Catherine's heart ached for him. He was proud, she realized. Too proud to accept help, even when he was clearly drowning. That evening, the need to understand became unbearable. Following him home wasn't enough anymore. She needed to see inside that small lighted window. She needed to understand the world he had built for his daughter. The idea that formed in her mind was both insane and brilliant. Stratos Innovations had a corporate philanthropy arm, which often partnered with community outreach programs. It wouldn't be difficult to arrange a visit to the local community center near his neighborhood, under the guise of scouting for new charitable investment opportunities. And from there, it took 2 days of calls by her formidable assistant, who asked no questions to set it up. On a Thursday afternoon, Catherine found herself walking through Owen's neighborhood in broad daylight, flanked by a nervous community center director. She feigned interest in after-school programs and funding for a new computer lab, but her eyes were scanning everything, absorbing the atmosphere of Owen's world. It was a community of working-class families of people who knew each other's names and watched each other's children. It was everything her sterile, high-rise world was not. As the tour concluded, Catherine feigned a sudden dizzy spell. "The flight from Geneva yesterday has just caught up with me. She lied smoothly to the concerned director. "Would you mind if I just sat in your office for a moment with a glass of water? Please continue with your day. I'll see myself out when I'm feeling better." The ruse worked perfectly. Alone in the small office, she waited until the director was busy in another part of the building. Her heart hammering against her ribs, she slipped out a back door. Owen's apartment building was just 2 blocks away. The main door was unlocked. The hallway smelled of old carpets and disinfectant. It was clean, but worn. She climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Apartment 2B. The name on the small card next to the door read, O. Jensen. She didn't know what she was going to do. Knock, invent a story. But as she stood there, she noticed the door was slightly ajar, as if it hadn't been closed properly. And she could hear voices from within. A man's voice, soft and patient, and a child's laughter. Against every rational instinct, she pushed the door open a few more inches, her opening just wide enough to peer through. The apartment was small, meticulously clean, and filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. The furniture was old and mismatched, but arranged with care. The walls, instead of being adorned with expensive art, were covered in Maya's crayon drawings, the same vibrant, cheerful style as the one Catherine had found. Owen and Maya were sitting at a small kitchen table. But they weren't eating dinner. The table was covered not with plates, but with blueprints. Large architectural drawings were spread out, and Owen was pointing to different sections, explaining them to his daughter in simple terms. "And this, my little sprout," he was saying, his voice filled with a passion that was entirely absent in his janitorial work, "is where the community garden will go. We'll use recycled water from the roof to grow vegetables for everyone in the building." "And the solar panels, Daddy?" Maya asked, her voice bright and curious. "The solar panels go right here." He tapped the roof of the building on the blueprint. "So we can make our own electricity from the sun. It's better for the earth." Catherine stared, mesmerized. This was the man from the sketchbook. He wasn't just a janitor. He was an architect, a visionary designing eco-friendly, sustainable housing on his tiny kitchen table in a rundown apartment. He was still dreaming, still creating despite the crushing weight of his circumstances. Then the scene shifted. "Okay, my love," Owen said, his tone becoming more serious. "Time for your treatment before we finish our homework." He carefully rolled up the blueprints and put them aside. He retrieved a small machine from a cupboard, a nebulizer. Maya, without any complaint, sat patiently as her father fitted the mask over her small face. The machine whirred to life, and the small apartment was filled with its steady mechanical hum. Owen sat beside her, one hand resting gently on her back, the other holding one of her small hands in his. He started to hum. It was the lullaby, the same haunting, beautiful melody that had drifted down the sterile corridors of Stratos Tower. He hummed it softly, his voice a low, comforting rumble, a shield against the sterile hiss of the machine. He was using the melody to soothe his daughter through her breathing treatment. In that moment, standing in the doorway like a thief, Catherine Blackwood finally broke. The sight of this brilliant man forced into menial labor, still clinging to his dreams, using a half-remembered tune to comfort his sick child through a medical procedure, it was too much. It was a portrait of love so pure, so resilient, so devastatingly beautiful that it shattered the final vestiges of her emotional armor. Silent tears streamed down her face, blurring the scene in front of her. She wasn't just crying for them. She was crying for her own barren life, for the husband she had lost, for the father whose lullaby now belonged to someone else's pain. She was crying because, in this tiny, humble apartment, there was more life, more love, and more meaning than in all 44 floors of her glass tower. She backed away slowly, pulling the door silently closed, her body trembling with the force of her sobs. She stumbled down the stairs and out into the fading afternoon light, a woman completely undone. The mystery was solved, but the truth was 1,000 times more painful and beautiful than she could have ever imagined. And she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that she could no longer remain a spectator. She had to do something. Her world and Owen Jensen's had collided, and the fallout was just beginning. The image of Owen administering Maya's breathing treatment was burned into Catherine's mind. The whir of the nebulizer and the soft, sad notes of the lullaby became the new soundtrack to her sleepless nights. Her detached curiosity had been annihilated, replaced by a firestorm of emotion, empathy, admiration, and a profound, gnawing guilt. She, who sat atop a multi-billion-dollar corporation, had every resource at her fingertips. Yet this man with nothing was a far richer human being. Her role as a secret observer was no longer tenable. It felt predatory, a violation of the sanctity of the life she had witnessed. But direct intervention was impossible. What could she say? "Hello, I'm your boss. I've been following you, and I peeked into your apartment. Can I help you?" The thought was absurd, a certain path to a restraining order and a corporate scandal. She needed information, not just the surface-level data from his HR file, but the full story. She needed to understand how a man with the mind of a visionary architect ended up mopping floors for a living. This required a level of investigation that went beyond her assistant's discreet inquiries. It required someone who specialized in finding the stories buried beneath the surface of a life. It required her head of security, a man named Arthur Vance. Arthur was a former FBI agent, a quiet, scrupulous man in his late 50s whose loyalty to Catherine was absolute. He had been a close friend of her late husband, Richard, and had been a pillar of quiet support after his death. Summoning him to her office for a matter like this felt like a betrayal of his professionalism, but she had no other choice. "Arthur." She began, her voice unusually hesitant, as he sat opposite her at the vast mahogany desk. "I have a delicate and highly confidential request." Arthur simply nodded, his face impassive. "Of course, Catherine. It concerns an employee, a night shift janitor. His name is Owen Jensen." She pushed a file containing his basic information across the desk. "I want to know everything about him. His career before he came to us, his family history, his financial situation. Everything." And Arthur, she leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "This must be completely off the record. No digital trail. No one can know that I am the one asking." For the first time in years, Catherine saw a flicker of surprise in Arthur's eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He was a professional. He simply took the file. "I understand. I'll handle it personally." The next 3 days were agonizing. Catherine went through the motions of her job, but her mind was elsewhere. Every decision she made, every dollar sign she saw, was filtered through the lens of Owen's struggle. The extravagance of a corporate luncheon felt obscene. The debate over multi-million-dollar executive bonuses felt grotesque. She was living in a world of make-believe, while Owen and Maya were living a life that was terrifyingly real. On Friday afternoon, Arthur returned. He entered her office and closed the door soundlessly behind him. He placed a single plain manila folder on her desk. There were no digital copies. "You were right to be cautious," he said, his voice low. "It's a complicated story." Catherine's hand trembled slightly as she opened the folder. The first page was a summary. Owen Jensen, age 39. graduated top of his class from the Stirling City University School of Architecture, married his college sweetheart Claire. Together they founded a small, innovative architectural firm, Jensen Design Studios. The report detailed the firm's philosophy. They specialized in green architecture and sustainable, affordable urban housing projects. They were passionate, brilliant, and on the cusp of greatness, winning several prestigious design awards. Catherine felt a knot of admiration and sadness form in her chest. Then the story turned. The next section was titled Financial Collapse. 6 years ago, Jensen Design Studios had poured all of its resources into a groundbreaking community redevelopment project called the Willow Creek Project. They were partnered with a mid-size development company, a firm called Northgate Developments, which had secured the primary funding. The name hit Catherine like a physical blow. Northgate Developments. She knew that name. It was a company her husband Richard had acquired a controlling interest in 7 years ago as part of an aggressive expansion phase for Stratos. It was one of his pet projects, an attempt to diversify their portfolio. Her blood ran cold. She read on her heart, pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. Arthur's report was meticulous. Northgate, under Richard's new aggressive management, had overextended itself. They made a series of risky financial maneuvers to fast-track several projects at once, including Willow Creek. When a sudden downturn hit the real estate market, Northgate's funding for the project collapsed almost overnight. They defaulted on their commitments, declared a specialized bankruptcy for that division, and legally walled themselves off from the fallout. The consequences for their partners were catastrophic. Jensen Design Studios, as the primary contractor, was left holding millions in unpaid invoices and contractual obligations to suppliers and subcontractors. They were ruined, wiped out. Owen and his wife lost everything: their business, their savings, their home. The report included newspaper clippings detailing the tragic collapse of the promising firm, with a photo of a much younger, more hopeful-looking Owen standing in front of his shuttered office. The worst was yet to come. The final section of the report was titled Personal Tragedy. In the midst of the financial ruin and the crushing stress, Owen's wife Claire, who had a previously managed congenital heart condition, suffered a massive coronary event. She died within a week of the bankruptcy filing. The report included a copy of the obituary. She was 32. She left behind her husband and their 2-year-old daughter, Maya. Catherine dropped the papers on her desk as if they were on fire. She leaned back in her chair, gasping for air. The room seemed to tilt the city lights outside, blurring into meaningless streaks. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a stranger's tragedy. It was her company, her husband. Richard, in his ambitious, often reckless pursuit of growth, had shattered this man's life. He had destroyed his dream, taken his home, and indirectly had contributed to the death of his wife. And for the last 2 years, as a final cruel twist of fate, Owen Jensen had been cleaning the floors of the very corporation that had orchestrated his downfall, working for the widow of the man who had ruined him. The guilt was a physical thing, a crushing weight on her chest that made it impossible to breathe. Her pursuit of Owen, which had started as a flicker of curiosity, now felt like a karmic joke of the cruelest kind. She had been drawn to his pain because her own legacy was its source. The lullaby wasn't the only echo connecting them. The ghosts of their dead spouses were in the room as well. Catherine. Arthur's voice was gentle, pulling her back from the abyss. He had seen the look on her face. He knew what she had discovered. He had been Richard's friend after all. He likely remembered the Northgate acquisition. Did Richard know? She whispered, her voice hoarse. Did he know what happened to them? Arthur hesitated. Richard operated at a very high level, Catherine. To him, Northgate was a subsidiary, and the Willow Creek project was a line item that went red. He would have seen the write-off. I doubt he ever knew the names Owen or Claire Jensen. To him it would have been collateral damage in a failed venture. Collateral damage. The words were clinical cold and utterly devastating. Owen Jensen and his family were collateral damage. Catherine stood up and walked to the window, wrapping her arms around herself. The glittering city below no longer looked like a kingdom. It looked like a crime scene. Her fortune, her power, the very building she was standing in, felt as though it were built on the foundations of this man's ruined life. She now understood his pride, his refusal to accept help from the woman in the park. He was a man who had everything taken from him, and his dignity was the only thing he had left. The revelation changed everything. This was no longer about charity or pity. This was about justice, atonement. She owed Owen Jensen a debt that could never truly be repaid, but damn it, she had to try. Her vague notion of doing something now had a terrifying clarity. But how? How could she possibly begin to unravel a wound this deep without revealing the devastating truth? Admitting her connection to his ruin would be like dousing him in salt. But doing nothing, letting him continue to scrub floors in the shadow of his destroyer, was a moral impossibility. She turned from the window, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with a new, terrifying resolve. "Thank you, Arthur. That will be all." He nodded and left, leaving her alone with the ghost of her husband and the unbearable weight of her new knowledge. The question was no longer if she would intervene. The question was how, and she knew with a chilling certainty that any action she took would have explosive, life-altering consequences for them both. The weight of her discovery settled on Catherine like a shroud. Sleep offered no escape. Her dreams were filled with images of collapsing buildings and the ghost of a young woman named Claire. Her entire life, the empire she commanded, now felt tainted, built on a foundation of unknowing cruelty. She couldn't look at her reflection without seeing the wife of the man who had ruined Owen Jensen. Her first instinct was to write a check, a large anonymous check that could solve all his financial problems, but she dismissed the idea as quickly as it came. It was a coward solution, an insult to his pride. His life wasn't a line item that could be balanced with a cash infusion. What he had lost was immeasurable. Atonement required more than money. It required action, opportunity, and a restoration of dignity. She began to formulate a plan, a delicate and dangerous one. Stratos Innovations had a small, mostly dormant architectural division that managed the construction and renovation of its corporate properties. Her plan was to revitalize it, rebranding it as a new, sustainable urban development initiative. It was the perfect vehicle. It aligned with modern corporate responsibility. Trends would be a good PR move and would create a legitimate high-level position for a visionary architect. A position tailor-made for Owen. But she couldn't just offer it to him. He was a janitor. HR protocols, corporate structure, and simple logic made a direct promotion from janitor to department head impossible without raising 1,000 questions she couldn't answer. She had to create a situation where his talent could be discovered organically. While Catherine was plotting in her glass tower, however, Owen's world was beginning to crumble under more immediate pressures. The storm that had been gathering on his horizon was about to break. His antagonist came in the form of a man named Frank Peterson. Peterson was the mid-level facilities manager, a man whose small fiefdom was the cleaning and maintenance staff of the Stratos Tower. He was a petty tyrant, insecure in his position, and resentful of anyone who didn't show him what he considered to be the proper degree of deference. He had taken a dislike to Owen from the start. Owen was too quiet, too intelligent in the eyes. He didn't engage in the break-room gossip or laugh at Peterson's stale jokes. He just did his work with a quiet diligence that Peterson misinterpreted as arrogance. Peterson began to ride him. He would inspect Owen's sections with a white glove, searching for any speck of dust he might have missed. He would change Owen's schedule at the last minute, making it a nightmare to coordinate childcare. He would make snide remarks, just loud enough for Owen to hear. "Think you're too good for this Jensen with that college degree." Owen endured it all with a stoic silence. He couldn't afford to lose this job. It was the only thing standing between him and total destitution. Maya's new medication was ruinously expensive, and a recent rent increase had pushed his fragile budget to the breaking point. The visit from his sister-in-law, the one Catherine had witnessed, had been about that. She had begged him to move in with her, to give up his pride and accept help. He had refused. This small apartment, this life he had carved out for himself and Maya, was his last stand. One evening, Peterson decided to escalate his campaign of harassment. He found a small scratch on the marble floor outside the main boardroom, a floor Owen had just finished polishing. It was a pre-existing Mark I that had been there for years. But Peterson saw his chance. He cornered Owen by his supply closet. "Jensen, my office. Now." Catherine happened to be walking towards the elevators, having just concluded a late-night call with the Tokyo office. She saw the confrontation from the end of the hall and instinctively flattened herself against the wall in a darkened alcove, her heart leaping into her throat. "What's this?" Peterson demanded, his voice dripping with false authority as he pointed a stubby finger at a photo of the scratch on his phone. "This is Italian marble, Jensen. You know what this costs to repair. This is coming out of your paycheck. If I don't fire you for incompetence first." "Mr. Peterson." Owen's voice was low and steady, but Catherine could hear the tightly coiled tension in it. "That mark has been there since I started working here. I have noted it on my checklist several times." "Are you calling me a liar?" Peterson puffed out his chest. "I see the way you walk around here with your nose in the air, like you're better than the rest of us. Well, you're not. You're a janitor. And you just damaged thousands of dollars of company property. You're on your final warning." Owen just stood there, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was trapped. To argue would be insubordination. To accept the blame was to admit fault for something he didn't do, and to lose money he desperately needed. He finally just nodded, a barely perceptible dip of his head. "Yes, sir." The raw injustice of the scene made Catherine see red. She wanted to stride out there and obliterate Peterson to fire him on the spot, but she couldn't. It would expose her interest in Owen, ruin her carefully laid plans. She was the CEO, a remote, almost mythical figure to these men. She couldn't be seen meddling in the day-to-day squabbles of the facility's staff. To do so would be to invite scrutiny. Forcing herself to remain hidden, she watched Peterson swagger away, pleased with his pathetic display of power. She watched Owen stand there for a full minute, his shoulders slumped in defeat, before he turned and slowly pushed his cart down the hallway. The superhero was being crushed by a troll. The incident galvanized Catherine. Her plan wasn't moving fast enough. Owen was at the mercy of men like Peterson, and his situation was clearly more precarious than she'd even realized. She had to accelerate things. The next day, she called an emergency meeting with the heads of HR and corporate development. She announced the launch of the Stratos Green Future Initiative, her rebranded sustainable architecture division. To kickstart it, she announced a company-wide innovation challenge. Any employee from any department could submit a proposal for a sustainable community-focused building project. The winner would receive a significant cash prize and a key role in the new division. It was a long shot, a message in a bottle cast into the vast ocean of her corporation. She had HR plaster notices in every break room, every cafeteria, every service elevator. She made sure the language was inclusive, encouraging ideas from all levels of the company. She hoped, prayed, that the notice would find its way to a man with a sketchbook, a man who designed solar-powered community gardens on his kitchen table. But as she set her plan in motion, another more urgent notice was being delivered to Owen's world. Taped to the door of apartment 2B on Hawthorne Avenue was a formal, bright pink eviction notice. His landlord, tired of late rent payments, had started the legal process. He had 30 days to pay the full back rent plus penalties, or he and Maya would be out on the street. The storm had broken. Owen Jensen was out of time. He was a man with blueprints for the future, but his present was about to be repossessed. And Catherine in her tower was completely unaware that her carefully constructed game of chess was about to be swept off the board by the brutal reality of Owen's life. The pink eviction notice taped to his door was a death sentence to Owen's fragile stability. 30 days to pay an impossible sum or be homeless. The notice crushed the last vestiges of his hope. He worked in a daze, the weight of his impending failure, a physical ache in his bones. He saw the flyers for the company's Innovation Challenge, a contest with a prize that could solve all his problems. For a fleeting moment, the architect in him stirred, but he quickly crushed the thought. A janitor submitting blueprints. It was a fantasy. He left the flyer folded in his pocket, a paper monument to a life he couldn't have. A week later, nature conspired against him. Wildfires in the hills choked Stirling City in a thick, hazardous smog. For Maya, with her delicate lungs, the air was poison. Her coughing grew worse, her small body struggling with every breath. One night, her fight for air became a terrifying, wheezing gasp. Panic seized Owen as he saw the bluish tinge on her lips. He snatched her up and sprinted through the smoky streets to the emergency room. The hospital was a blur of urgent activity. After what felt like an eternity, a doctor informed him Maya was stable, but needed to be admitted for observation. Relief was immediately swallowed by a wave of cold dread. A hospital stay meant catastrophic bills and missed work. He had left a frantic message for his manager Peterson, knowing it was a violation of the strict call-out policy. His phone rang the next morning. It was Peterson, his voice cold as steel. "Jensen, I got your message," he sneered. "Unacceptable. A second no-show is grounds for immediate termination." "Mr. Peterson, please," Owen begged, his voice raw with exhaustion. "My daughter is in the hospital. It was an emergency." "Everyone has a story, Jensen," Peterson replied, devoid of empathy. "Clean out your locker. Your final check will be mailed." The line went dead. Owen stared at the silent phone. Fired. The final thread had snapped. No job, an eviction notice, a sick child in a hospital bed. He had hit rock bottom, a man utterly defeated by a world that refused to give him a chance. Back in the Stratos Tower, Catherine's anxiety grew. The deadline for her challenge was approaching with no submission from Owen. Her carefully laid plan was failing. That afternoon, her fears were confirmed in the worst possible way. As she walked past a service corridor, she overheard two janitors talking. "Yeah, Peterson fired him this morning. Owen, the quiet guy, said his kid's in the hospital or something. Peterson's a real piece of work." The word struck Catherine with the force of a physical blow. Fired. Hospital. She had been playing a long, subtle game while his house was burning down. A cold, clear rage replaced her caution. Her time for acting from the shadows was over. She strode back to her office, a woman transformed. She buzzed her assistant. Get me Frank Peterson from facilities in my office. Now, she commanded, her voice like ice. And get the head of HR up here 10 minutes after he arrives. Then find out what hospital Owen Jensen's daughter was admitted to. I don't care how you do it. Just do it. The breaking point had been reached, and Catherine Blackwood was about to unleash her storm. Frank Peterson entered Catherine Blackwood's office with a self-important swagger, assuming a commendation. He found the CEO standing like a statue by the window. When she turned, her face was glacial. "Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "You terminated an employee this morning, Owen Jensen." "Yes, Miss Blackwood," he preened. "A clear violation of policy. Unreliable." "Unreliable." Catherine's voice dripped with contempt. His young daughter, who has a severe respiratory condition, was rushed to the hospital. While you were sleeping comfortably, he was fighting for his child's life. Did you know that before you fired him, Mr. Peterson? The color drained from Peterson's face. I wasn't aware." "Precisely," Catherine snapped. "You were not aware that you just fired a summa cum laude graduate in architecture, a man whose design firm was once the most promising in this city. You were just exercising your pathetic power." Just then, the head of HR entered on cue. "Helen," Catherine said coolly, "Mr. Peterson is tendering his resignation, effective immediately. Please escort him out." Within minutes, Catherine was in her car, racing towards Sterling City General. She found Owen in the pediatric wing, a hollowed-out man slumped in a chair. "Owen," she said softly, approaching him. "I've handled Mr. Peterson. Your job is safe, but that's not why I'm here." He looked up, confused and exhausted. She sat beside him, the confession she had to make feeling like poison on her tongue. "This isn't charity. Our lives are connected. My late husband was Richard Blackwood. Years ago, his company acquired Northgate Developments." The name struck Owen like a physical blow. His face went ashen as the horrifying connection dawned on him. Northgate. The company that had destroyed his firm, his life, his wife. "I only recently discovered the truth." Catherine pressed on her voice, thick with emotion. "The guilt is unbearable. Owen, I saw your talent, your blueprints. I created the Stratus Green Future Initiative for you. It needs a director, a visionary. It needs you." It was a staggering offer, a lifeline thrown across a chasm of grief and history. Owen stared at her, the widow of the man who had ruined him, now offering him redemption. He looked from her tear-streaked face towards the door of his daughter's room. Maya was his entire world, and this woman was offering him a way to finally give her the life she deserved. All the anger and bitterness he had carried for years seemed to collapse under the weight of his exhaustion, and this one impossible spark of hope. Slowly, hesitantly, he gave a single decisive nod. "Okay," he whispered. It was not an ending, but a difficult, complicated beginning. In the quiet, sterile hallway of the hospital, two souls bound by tragedy laid the first stone of a new foundation, hoping to build a future upon the ruins of their past. The story of Catherine Blackwood and Owen Jensen is a powerful reminder that we are all so much more than the labels society places on us. A CEO is not just her title, and a janitor is not just his job. Beneath the surface of every person is a story of love loss, hidden talents, and silent struggles. Catherine, driven by a simple melody, chose to look past the uniform and see the man uncovering a truth that connected their pasts in the most devastating way. But from that devastation, they found a path to redemption and a second chance. Their journey teaches us that the greatest investments we can ever make are in people. It's a call to look up from our screens, to notice the invisible people who make our world run, and to lead with empathy. What did you think of their story? Have you ever had an encounter that made you realize you completely misjudged someone? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. Your perspective matters, and if this story moved you, please give it a thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more real-life stories that touch the heart. Thank you for listening.